Richard Blackwood's black Mercedes shattered the mountain silence as it carved through Colorado wilderness. $3 million. Gone. 12 neurosurgeons had declared his 16-year-old daughter a lost cause. The private investigator's final report burned in his mind. Dr. Nathan Hayes vanished without trace. Last seen, Millbrook Springs. Richard's fist hammered the splintered cabin door until it groaned open. The man who emerged looked carved from the mountains themselves, weathered face, work-stained flannel, hands gripping a carpenter's hammer with suspicious precision. "I need Dr. Hayes," Richard demanded, desperation bleeding through his billionaire composure. "No doctor here," the stranger replied, but his eyes betrayed him. They locked onto the wheelchair in Richard's car, with clinical intensity no handyman should possess. When Richard's voice cracked, "My daughter will die in that chair unless someone saves her," the stranger's facade crumbled. His hammer clattered to the porch. Something wounded flickered behind his eyes. "Let me help her." Nathan Hayes had been dead for 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days, buried beneath layers of grief so deep that even his own son didn't know the truth about the man who taught him to whittle wood and catch fireflies. The carpenter who'd taken his place lived in a cabin at the end of a dirt road that GPS couldn't find, surrounded by pine trees that whispered secrets to anyone willing to listen to the wind carry stories of loss and redemption through the mountain air. His hands, once steady enough to operate on human brains, now shaped only furniture and repaired broken shutters, finding peace in tasks that couldn't kill anyone if he made a mistake. Inside the cabin, the walls were bare except for a single photograph of a little girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Her image faded from 3 years of being the only remnant of the world Nathan had abandoned when everything he'd believed about healing turned to ash in his surgical gloves. Emily Martinez had been 7 years old when she died on his operating table, and her memory haunted every quiet moment when Nathan's mind wasn't occupied with the simple rhythms of manual labor that kept darker thoughts at bay. The medical journals hidden beneath Nathan's floorboards told a different story than the simple life he'd constructed in Millbrook Springs, their pages yellowed with age and marked with annotations in handwriting that grew increasingly desperate as the dates progressed toward that final, terrible entry. Dr. Nathan Hayes had been the youngest department head in Denver Medical Center's history, pioneering surgical techniques that restored hope to families who'd been told to prepare for funerals instead of birthday parties. His innovative approaches to spinal cord injuries had earned him invitations to lecture at universities around the world, but all of that belonged to a ghost who died alongside a child whose laugh would never again echo through his dreams. Nathan's transformation from celebrated surgeon to anonymous craftsman hadn't been sudden, but rather a gradual erosion of identity that began the moment Emily's heart monitor had flatlined, despite his desperate attempts to save the child he'd been raising as his own daughter. The experimental surgery had been his last hope for giving her the normal childhood that had been stolen by a construction accident, and when it failed, Nathan had simply walked away from the hospital and never returned. His colleagues had searched for him briefly, but grief was a powerful motivator for disappearing, and Nathan had proven remarkably effective at becoming invisible when the world felt too heavy to bear. Daniel Hayes knew only that his father was the strongest, gentlest man in Millbrook Springs, capable of fixing anything that broke and patient enough to teach a 10-year-old boy the difference between pine and oak by touch alone. The child had no memory of the prestigious life they'd abandoned, having been only 7 when Nathan had packed their belongings into a truck and driven until the roads ran out and the silence felt like forgiveness. Daniel's childhood was filled with mountain adventures and bedtime stories about brave carpenters who built homes for forest animals, tales that never mentioned operating rooms or the weight of holding someone's life in your hands. Their daily routine was sacred in its simplicity: breakfast at sunrise, work in the garden or workshop until lunch. Afternoons spent exploring trails that led deeper into wilderness, where cell phones couldn't reach and the past felt safely distant. Nathan had taught Daniel to read the forest like a book, identifying animal tracks and weather patterns with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to CT scans and surgical planning. The boy's laughter was medicine that Nathan hadn't known he needed, healing wounds that no scalpel could reach, and proving that some kinds of repair work required love rather than expertise. Nathan's workshop was filled with half-finished projects that served as meditation rather than profit, his hands finding peace in the grain of wood that responded to patient shaping rather than the unpredictable chaos of human anatomy. He'd built Daniel a treehouse that was architecturally impossible, with secret compartments and rope bridges that defied engineering logic but captured a child's imagination perfectly. The workshop walls displayed Daniel's artwork alongside Nathan's tools, creating a gallery that celebrated creativity and craftsmanship without the pressure of perfection that had once driven Nathan to attempt surgeries that pushed beyond the boundaries of medical possibility. Richard Blackwood's empire had been built on the principle that every problem had a solution if you were willing to pay the right price. But 4 months of throwing money at the finest medical minds in the country had taught him that some tragedies couldn't be purchased away with platinum credit cards and unlimited resources. His construction company had built half of Denver's skyline, but all that success felt meaningless when his daughter sat motionless in a wheelchair, staring through windows with eyes that had forgotten how to hope for tomorrow's possibilities. Bella had been the light of Richard's world since the day she'd arrived 2 months premature, fighting her way into life with the same determination that would later make her a state champion gymnast before a riding accident stole everything that had made her feel alive and powerful. The horse had been a birthday gift, a magnificent thoroughbred that Richard had imported from Kentucky because Bella had dreamed of competing in the Olympics someday. The accident had happened during her first solo ride, when the horse had spooked at something in the woods and thrown her against a fence post with enough force to change both their lives forever. The specialists at Johns Hopkins had used words like complete transection and permanent paralysis as if clinical terminology could somehow make the impossible easier to accept for a father who'd spent his entire career refusing to acknowledge limitations. Richard had flown in experts from Switzerland, Germany, and Japan, creating a medical team that represented the pinnacle of spinal cord research, but their unanimous conclusion remained unchanged. Bella would never walk again, and acceptance was the only treatment they could recommend for a family struggling to find meaning in senseless tragedy. The private investigator had cost Richard $50,000 and had tracked down every doctor who'd ever worked with experimental spinal cord treatments, following paper trails and whispered rumors through the medical underground until he'd finally uncovered the truth about Nathan Hayes' mysterious disappearance from Denver Medical Center. The file contained photographs of groundbreaking surgeries, testimonials from grateful families whose children had defied medical predictions, and news clippings about a brilliant surgeon who'd vanished after a personal tragedy that the hospital administration had covered up to protect their reputation and avoid malpractice lawsuits. Richard had driven 800 miles through Colorado wilderness, based on nothing more than hope and desperation, carrying Bella's medical records like sacred texts that might contain the key to bringing his daughter back to the world of the living. The journey had taken them through mountain passes where cell phone service disappeared and civilization felt like a distant memory, leading finally to Millbrook Springs and a cabin that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of geography and time. Richard's Mercedes looked absurdly out of place on the dirt road that led to Nathan's refuge, its polished surface reflecting pine trees that had witnessed decades of human drama without judgment or intervention. Nathan's hands trembled as he carried Bella into his cabin, muscle memory fighting against 3 years of deliberate forgetfulness as he assessed her condition with eyes that had been trained to see possibilities where others saw only defeat and surrender. Her spine told a story written in the language of trauma, but Nathan recognized signs that 12 specialists had either missed or dismissed as irrelevant to their pessimistic prognosis. The way she held her shoulders, the subtle responses to touch that suggested preserved sensation, the muscle tone that hadn't completely atrophied, despite months of inactivity, all indicators that pointed toward incomplete injury rather than the total severance that had condemned her to life in a wheelchair. Richard watched in fascinated silence as this mysterious mountain man examined his daughter with a gentleness that spoke of extensive experience with broken things, wondering if he'd stumbled upon salvation or simply traded one form of false hope for another kind of expensive disappointment. Nathan's touch was different from the clinical assessments Bella had endured at prestigious medical centers, carrying warmth and genuine care rather than the detached professionalism she'd grown accustomed to receiving from doctors who saw her as an interesting case study rather than a human being with dreams and fears. "Her injury is incomplete," Nathan said quietly, his voice carrying authority that didn't match his carpenter's appearance or the humble surroundings of a cabin that seemed designed for hiding rather than healing. The specialists who examined her were looking at scans and numbers instead of the whole picture. "There are neural pathways that remain intact, possibilities for recovery that everyone dismissed because they were afraid to offer hope that might be disappointed." Richard felt his heart begin to beat faster as Nathan explained what he'd observed, technical details delivered with the confidence of someone who understood spinal anatomy better than most textbooks could teach. The makeshift examination had revealed what Nathan had suspected from the moment he'd seen Bella's posture in the wheelchair. Her injury was severe but not hopeless, requiring innovative treatment approaches rather than resignation to permanent disability. "I need specialized equipment," Nathan told Richard, his voice growing stronger as medical instincts overrode the careful restraint he'd maintained for 3 years, in complete secrecy. "What I'm suggesting isn't exactly legal without proper licensing, and there are people who wouldn't understand why I'm willing to try methods that conventional medicine has abandoned as too risky or experimental." Richard's response was immediate and absolute, delivered with the certainty of a man accustomed to removing obstacles through strategic application of resources and influence. "Whatever you need, money is no object. Rules are problems to be solved, regulations are guidelines to be navigated, and silence is a commodity I've been purchasing my entire business career." His willingness to embrace illegal medical treatment surprised even him, but watching Nathan examine Bella had awakened something fierce and protective that transcended legal concerns or social conventions. If this mysterious healer could give his daughter a chance at walking again, Richard would move mountains to make it happen. Nathan's basement transformation began that same evening, with Richard arranging for medical equipment deliveries that arrived without paperwork or questions, creating a treatment facility that would have impressed medical professionals with its sophisticated understanding of spinal rehabilitation technology. The vendors who installed the apparatus were paid enough to forget the address and ignore the unusual circumstances of a carpenter who required surgical instruments and diagnostic equipment typically found only in major hospitals. Within 48 hours, the basement had become a hybrid between workshop and operating room, where Nathan's two identities could coexist without contradiction. Daniel emerged from his bedroom on the second morning, rubbing sleep from his eyes and confused by the presence of strangers in their home, but immediately drawn to Bella with the innocent curiosity that children possessed before the world taught them to look away from suffering or difference. "Daddy, why can't the pretty girl move her legs?" he asked with the directness that only 10-year-olds could manage, his question carrying genuine interest rather than the uncomfortable pity that adults usually offered when confronted with disability. Bella smiled for the first time in months, touched by Daniel's straightforward curiosity rather than the careful avoidance she'd grown accustomed to receiving from people who didn't know how to interact with someone in a wheelchair. "She got hurt," Nathan explained to his son, his voice gentle but honest in the way he'd always approached difficult topics with Daniel. "But we're going to try to help her feel better, the same way we help injured animals we find in the forest." Daniel nodded with the absolute acceptance that children brought to explanations from trusted adults, immediately appointing himself as Bella's companion and entertainment director, while his father worked on the mysterious healing process that adults seemed to understand better than kids. The boys' uncomplicated friendship became Bella's lifeline during long hours of treatment, offering distraction from fear and pain, while proving that human connection could exist independent of physical limitations. The first treatment session lasted 3 hours, during which Nathan's hands rediscovered their calling, as he guided Bella through movements designed to wake up neural pathways that had been dormant since her accident 4 months earlier. Richard watched from the corner of the basement, seeing his daughter respond to touch and pressure in ways that suggested miracles might still be possible in a world that had taught him to expect only disappointment and expensive failures from medical experts who promised more than they could deliver. Nathan's technique was unlike anything Richard had witnessed during their tour of prestigious medical facilities, combining traditional physical therapy with innovations that seemed to come from years of experience with similar cases. "I can feel that," Bella whispered during the second hour, her voice filled with wonder as Nathan manipulated pressure points along her spine that had been numb since the riding accident. "It's like electricity waking up after a power outage, signals moving through places that have been dark for so long I'd forgotten they existed." Nathan's response was carefully measured, years of medical training tempering his excitement with knowledge that recovery was a fragile process that couldn't be rushed or forced beyond its natural pace. He'd learned from Emily's case that hope was powerful medicine, but false hope could be devastating when disappointment inevitably followed unrealistic expectations. Daniel appointed himself as Bella's official entertainer, regaling her with stories about mountain adventures, and showing her treasures he'd collected during his explorations of the wilderness that surrounded their home, like a protective barrier against the outside world. "My daddy fixes everything that's broken," he announced with the absolute faith that children invested in their parents, his confidence so complete that Bella found herself believing that maybe this strange mountain man who worked magic with his hands might be able to fix the parts of her that expensive doctors had declared irreparable and permanently damaged. Nathan watched their friendship bloom with emotions that surprised him in their intensity, feeling something stirring in his chest that he'd thought died along with Emily, the possibility that healing could flow in multiple directions simultaneously, that helping Bella might also repair damage in his own heart that 3 years of isolation hadn't been able to touch. Daniel's innocent joy in having a new friend reminded Nathan of the simple pleasures that had made medicine meaningful before tragedy taught him to fear his own abilities and question every decision that involved risk to someone else's child. The breakthrough came during the second week of treatment, when Bella felt sensation returning to her fingertips like sunrise breaking through clouds that had blocked the light for months of darkness and despair. The moment was electric with possibility, sending signals through neural pathways that specialists had written off as permanently severed based on scans that captured structure, but missed the subtle signs of potential that required human touch to detect. Nathan's response was professionally restrained, but Richard saw tears in the healer's eyes that suggested this victory meant more than simple medical success. "It's working," Bella whispered, tears streaming down her face as she wiggled fingers that had been motionless for 4 months, each small movement representing hope that had been systematically crushed by expert opinions and statistical probabilities. Nathan felt the weight of 3 years' guilt begin to lift from his shoulders as he remembered why he'd fallen in love with medicine in the first place, not for the prestige or recognition, but for moments like this when human determination combined with skilled intervention to create possibilities that defied conventional wisdom and medical limitations. Richard's gratitude was overwhelming and uncomfortable, expressing itself in offers of money and influence that Nathan deflected with increasing awkwardness as he struggled to maintain the fiction that he was simply a gifted amateur rather than a trained professional with years of specialized education. The construction magnate couldn't understand why this miraculous healer lived in poverty when he could command any salary in the medical world. But Nathan's reasons for hiding from his former life were buried too deep in trauma for casual explanation to someone who'd never held a dying child in his arms. Daniel noticed the tension between the adults but couldn't understand why his daddy seemed sad even when the pretty girl was getting better. Asking questions that Nathan answered with careful evasions, designed to protect the child's innocence while preserving his own carefully constructed anonymity. "Why don't you want to be famous for helping people?" Daniel asked one evening, his 10-year-old logic struggling to understand why anyone would hide abilities that could make others happy. Nathan's answer was gentle but incomplete. "Sometimes being famous makes it harder to help the people who need you most." Dr. Marcus Peterson arrived on a Tuesday morning like a thunderstorm that had been building on the horizon for weeks, his presence at Nathan's cabin announcing that the medical world had finally tracked down their missing genius through channels that Nathan had thought were permanently closed. Peterson represented everything Nathan had abandoned: the prestige, the pressure, the institutional expectations that had ultimately cost him everything he'd valued more than professional recognition or academic achievement. His black SUV looked as out of place in Millbrook Springs as Richard's Mercedes had, but its implications were far more threatening to the peaceful existence Nathan had constructed from grief and determination. "You can't just disappear and practice medicine without oversight," Peterson declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to compliance rather than argument from subordinates who understood their place in medical hierarchies. "The board wants answers about your unauthorized departure, and the family whose daughter died on your table deserves to know why you ran instead of facing the consequences of your failure." His words hit Nathan like physical blows, reopening wounds that 3 years of mountain solitude hadn't completely healed and threatening the fragile peace he'd built through isolation and manual labor. The confrontation shattered the peaceful routine that had developed around Bella's treatment, forcing Nathan to choose between the anonymity that protected his sanity and the medical ethics that demanded he prioritize patient care above personal comfort or emotional safety. Richard found himself caught between conflicting loyalties, grateful for Nathan's miraculous work with Bella, but troubled by implications that his daughter's savior might be a doctor who'd fled from legitimate malpractice claims, rather than faced proper scrutiny from medical authorities and grieving families. Peterson's ultimatum was stark and unforgiving, delivered with the institutional weight of a medical establishment that didn't tolerate maverick behavior or unauthorized departures from accepted protocols. Return to Denver to answer for past failures and submit to proper review, or face prosecution for practicing medicine without current licensing while treating patients who deserve better than backwoods experimentation. His threat hung in the mountain air like smoke from a forest fire, carrying implications that could destroy not only Nathan's new life, but also Bella's chance at recovery if treatment was interrupted by legal complications. Nathan's medical history unraveled like thread from a worn garment, as Peterson revealed details that painted a picture of brilliance corrupted by tragedy and responsibility, abandoned in favor of cowardice that had left colleagues and patients without explanation. The truth was more complex than simple failure. Nathan had attempted an experimental procedure on Emily Martinez, a 7-year-old girl whose spinal cord injury had been deemed inoperable by every other surgeon, consulted by her desperate parents who'd exhausted conventional treatments and traditional medical opinions. "Emily was my daughter," Nathan said quietly, his confession stopping Peterson's accusations mid-sentence like a record player suddenly unplugged. "Not biologically, but in every way that mattered. I adopted her after her parents were killed in a construction accident that damaged her spine, and I spent 2 years trying everything conventional medicine could offer before attempting the experimental surgery that killed her." His words carried 3 years of accumulated grief and self-recrimination, painting a picture that was far different from the professional failure Peterson had assumed when tracking down the missing surgeon. The revelation changed the entire dynamic of Peterson's investigation, transforming Nathan from a doctor running from malpractice into a parent who'd fled from unbearable loss that no amount of medical training could have prepared him to handle. "The operation showed promise for the first 48 hours, Nathan continued, his voice growing stronger as he faced demons he'd been avoiding for 3 years. "Emily was responding to stimulation, showing signs of recovery that exceeded our most optimistic projections. Then complications set in: bleeding that we couldn't control, swelling that put pressure on healthy tissue, cascading failures that turned hope into nightmare." Richard listened to Nathan's story with growing understanding of the complexity that had driven this brilliant surgeon into exile, recognizing parallels between Nathan's guilt and his own struggles with responsibility for decisions that had unintended consequences. Bella remained silent throughout the confrontation, absorbing information that recontextualized everything she'd believed about her miraculous recovery, and the man who'd brought hope back into her life after months of medical professionals offering only sympathy and resignation. Daniel crept down the stairs during the heated discussion, his 10-year-old mind struggling to understand why strangers were saying terrible things about his daddy, who'd never been anything but gentle and careful with every living creature they'd encountered together in their mountain sanctuary. "Daddy's not bad," he said suddenly, his child's voice cutting through adult arguments like a knife through pretension. "He saves everything: birds with broken wings, rabbits caught in traps, plants that are dying. He wouldn't hurt anyone on purpose." Peterson's investigation had uncovered details about Emily's case that revealed the full scope of tragedy that had destroyed Nathan's faith in his own judgment and sent him fleeing from a profession that had defined his identity since childhood. The construction accident that had killed Emily's parents and damaged her spine had occurred at a Blackwood construction site, where safety violations and cost-cutting measures had created conditions that led to catastrophic equipment failure during what should have been a routine inspection by city officials and insurance representatives. Richard's face went white as Peterson continued his recitation of facts that connected dots in ways that made cosmic justice feel like cosmic cruelty. The crane collapse killed 2 workers and critically injured their 7-year-old daughter who'd been visiting the site during a school field trip to see her parents' workplace, Peterson said, unaware that every word was driving nails into Richard's conscience. Safety investigators found evidence of inadequate maintenance and corner cutting that violated multiple OSHA regulations, but the company settled out of court and avoided criminal prosecution through strategic legal maneuvering. Nathan's eyes found Richard's across the cabin's main room, understanding passing between them like electric current as the full implications of their connection became clear. Richard had authorized the safety shortcuts that had caused the accident, then used his influence and resources to minimize legal exposure, while Nathan had struggled to save the lives of victims that Richard's decisions had endangered. The irony was almost unbearable. The man whose negligence had created Emily's injuries was now begging the surgeon who'd failed to save her to rescue his own daughter from a similar fate. "You killed my daughter," Nathan said quietly, his voice carrying more sadness than anger, as he processed the revelation that made their current situation feel like punishment designed by a universe with a cruel sense of poetic justice. "Your negligence, your cost-cutting, your profits over people philosophy created the conditions that destroyed Emily's spine and forced me to attempt surgery that was beyond the limits of what medicine could safely accomplish." Richard had no defense against accusations that carried the weight of absolute truth and devastating personal consequences. I remember the accident, Richard replied, his voice barely above a whisper as memories he'd successfully suppressed for 3 years came flooding back with crystal clarity. The families, the settlements, the media coverage that we managed to contain through expensive public relations firms. But I never knew the surgeon's name, never made the connection between the child we'd injured and the doctor who tried to save her. His confession felt inadequate against the magnitude of damage his decisions had caused, corporate responsibility seeming abstract until faced with personal consequences that couldn't be resolved through financial settlements or legal maneuvering. Nathan's response to the revelation was a mixture of rage and resignation that reflected his complex relationship with guilt, responsibility, and the tragic circumstances that had brought them together. Emily would have wanted me to help Bella, he said finally, his voice carrying the wisdom that could only come from processing unbearable loss and finding meaning in continuing service to others. She was always trying to help injured animals we found in the woods, always asking why bad things happened to good creatures who didn't deserve to suffer. Daniel's bicycle accident occurred during the height of the emotional chaos surrounding Nathan's revealed identity, sending the 10-year-old tumbling down a steep mountain slope when his attention was distracted by adult arguments he couldn't fully understand, but sensed were threatening his family's carefully constructed peace. The injuries were severe compressed vertebrae, swelling around the spinal cord, damage that required immediate surgical intervention to prevent permanent paralysis that would steal Daniel's future, the same way Emily's death had stolen Nathan's past. Nathan found himself facing the same impossible choice that had destroyed his life 3 years earlier: risk another child's future on surgical skills that had failed when they mattered most, or allow fear and guilt to prevent him from using abilities that might be the only thing standing between Daniel and a lifetime of disability. Richard watched in agonized silence as the man he'd blamed for his daughter's suffering wrestled with decisions that no parent should ever have to make about their own child's survival and future mobility. "I can't," Nathan whispered, his hands trembling as he examined Daniel's injuries with the clinical detachment that medical training had taught him to maintain even in emotional crisis. "What if I fail again? What if my arrogance costs another child their life? What if Daniel ends up like Emily, dead because I believed I could accomplish what others couldn't and refused to accept the limitations that exist for good reasons?" His fear was palpable, filling the cabin with tension that made breathing difficult for everyone present. Peterson watched the drama unfold with growing understanding of the psychological trauma that had driven Nathan into exile, recognizing that medical skill couldn't be separated from emotional confidence when dealing with life and death decisions. "You're the only one here qualified to help him," Peterson said quietly, his antagonism transformed into professional respect for the impossible position Nathan faced. "Your fear doesn't change the fact that Daniel needs surgery, and you're the most skilled neurosurgeon within 500 miles of this mountain." The surgery that saved Daniel's life took place in Nathan's makeshift basement operating room, using equipment that Richard had acquired for Bella's treatment, and skills that 3 years of exile hadn't diminished despite the trauma that had driven Nathan away from medicine. Nathan's hands were steady as he repaired damaged vertebrae and relieved pressure on compressed nerve tissue, guided by muscle memory and paternal desperation, rather than the professional confidence that had once made him famous throughout the medical community. Peterson observed the procedure in respectful silence, recognizing the level of expertise that no amount of guilt or self-doubt could completely erase from hands that had been trained to heal through years of education and practice. Nathan's technique was flawless, his decision-making sound, his touch gentle but precise as he navigated anatomical challenges that would have challenged surgeons with access to full hospital facilities and complete support staff. The operation lasted 4 hours, during which Nathan rediscovered his identity as a healer rather than a man haunted by failure. Richard and Bella waited upstairs during the surgery, both understanding that Daniel's recovery would determine whether Nathan could find peace with his past or remain forever trapped by guilt that prevented him from using gifts that could benefit other children who needed his expertise. Bella held Richard's hand while they listened to sounds from the basement that indicated whether hope or tragedy would define the next chapter of their intertwined stories. Daniel's successful recovery proved that Nathan's surgical abilities remained intact despite the emotional damage that had convinced him he was too dangerous to practice medicine, but the victory felt complicated rather than triumphant, given the larger context of tragedy that had brought all of them together. Nathan had saved his own son using techniques he'd developed while trying to save Emily, creating a circle of healing and loss that connected 3 families across years of grief and misunderstanding that couldn't be resolved through medical intervention alone. "You did it," Daniel whispered when he woke up in his own bed 12 hours after surgery, his voice weak but his smile bright enough to illuminate the cabin's dim interior. "I knew you could fix me, Daddy. You fix everything." Nathan's response was a mixture of relief and renewed commitment to the calling he'd abandoned, understanding finally that Emily's death had been tragedy rather than failure, that medical limits existed independent of surgeon skill or parental love. The conversation between Nathan and Richard that followed Daniel's surgery lasted until dawn, with both men confronting the ways their past decisions had created the present crisis, while searching for paths toward forgiveness that neither had believed possible when their worlds had first collided. Richard accepted responsibility for the safety violations that had killed Emily's parents and created the conditions that led to her death, while Nathan acknowledged that his exile had been an act of emotional self-preservation disguised as principled withdrawal from institutional medicine. "I can't bring Emily back," Richard said as morning light filtered through cabin windows that had witnessed 3 years of Nathan's self-imposed exile from the world of healing and hope. "But I can honor her memory by using everything I've learned about responsibility and consequences to prevent other families from experiencing what we've both endured." His offer to fund a memorial clinic in Emily's name represented more than charitable gesture. It was an attempt at redemption that could transform personal tragedy into societal benefit. Nathan's decision to return to medicine wasn't motivated by Peterson's threats or Richard's financial inducements, but by his recognition that hiding from his calling hadn't honored Emily's memory or protected other children from the suffering he'd witnessed throughout his career before tragedy taught him to question every decision that involved risk to young lives. The memorial clinic that Richard proposed building offered Nathan a chance to practice medicine on his own terms, serving families who couldn't afford expensive specialists while developing treatments for spinal cord injuries that might prevent other parents from facing the impossible choices that had destroyed his own peace of mind. Emily believed that everyone deserved help when they were hurt, Nathan said, as they watched sunrise paint the mountains in shades of hope and possibility. She never understood why some animals got better while others didn't, why healing sometimes worked and sometimes failed despite everyone's best efforts. Maybe the clinic could be a place where her questions finally get answered, where other children don't have to wonder why bad things happen to good people. Peterson grudgingly agreed to support Nathan's license restoration in exchange for his cooperation with ongoing research into experimental techniques that had shown promise despite their tragic associations with Emily's case. The medical establishment needed innovations that Nathan had developed, and Nathan needed institutional support that could legitimize his work while protecting him from legal challenges that might interrupt treatment for patients who required his unique expertise and understanding of complex spinal injuries. Bella's recovery accelerated once Nathan stopped fighting his own instincts and approached her treatment with the full weight of his medical knowledge, rather than the careful restraint of someone afraid to hope for success or risk. Disappointment. His techniques became more aggressive, his goals more ambitious, his confidence rebuilt through Daniel's successful surgery and Peterson's professional validation of methods that had been developed through years of experience with cases that conventional medicine couldn't address adequately. 6 months after Richard had first knocked on Nathan's cabin door, carrying desperation, disguised as determination, Bella took her first independent steps since the riding accident, walking across the clinic floor with the grace that had once made her a champion gymnast before tragedy temporarily stole her dreams of Olympic competition. Nathan watched her progress with pride that was tempered by understanding that Emily would never have the same opportunity, but her memory had been transformed from a source of guilt into inspiration for continuing work that gave his life meaning beyond personal satisfaction or professional recognition. The Emily Martinez Memorial Clinic opened 18 months after Nathan's reluctant return to medicine, featuring state-of-the-art equipment for spinal cord research and rehabilitation programs designed to serve families regardless of their ability to pay for treatment that insurance companies often classified as experimental rather than medically necessary. Nathan's revolutionary techniques attracted patients from across the country, but he maintained strict limits on his caseload to ensure that each family received the personal attention that had been missing from the corporate medical environment he'd rejected after Emily's death, taught him that healing required human connection as much as technical expertise. Richard served as the clinic's primary benefactor and board chairman, using his business expertise to create sustainable funding models that would continue Emily's legacy long after the current generation of administrators had moved on to other challenges and philanthropic causes. His transformation from ruthless businessman to compassionate advocate hadn't erased the consequences of his past decisions. but it had given him a path toward redemption that honored the families his corporate shortcuts had damaged, while preventing similar tragedies from occurring in construction sites that prioritized safety over profit margins. Bella's gymnastics career resumed with modifications that accommodated the residual effects of her injury, while celebrating the remarkable recovery that had restored her ability to compete at levels that specialists had declared impossible based on scan results and statistical probabilities. She became an advocate for spinal cord research and rehabilitation programs, speaking at medical conferences about the importance of hope and persistence in recovery processes that often required years of patient work rather than dramatic breakthroughs that captured media attention but rarely reflected clinical reality. Daniel's relationship with Nathan deepened as the boy learned about his father's true profession and the reasons he'd hidden from a world that had once celebrated his achievements, before tragedy taught him to fear his own abilities. The 10-year-old couldn't fully understand the complex emotions that had driven Nathan into exile, but he recognized the peace that had returned to his father's eyes as he embraced his identity as a healer rather than rejecting it as a source of pain and self-recrimination that served no constructive purpose. The photograph of Emily that had once been Nathan's only companion in exile now occupied a place of honor in the clinic's main hallway, surrounded by pictures of children whose lives had been transformed by treatments that honored her memory, while advancing beyond the experimental techniques that had failed to save her despite everyone's best efforts and intentions. Nathan still felt the weight of her loss, but it no longer paralyzed him with guilt or prevented him from forming connections with other young patients who needed his expertise and compassion more than they needed his personal suffering as penance for failures that belonged to the limitations of medicine rather than inadequacies of individual practitioners. The quiet Sunday morning when Bella competed in her first gymnastics meet since the accident marked a milestone that none of them had dared hope for during those desperate early days when recovery seemed impossible and hope felt like cruelty rather than medicine. Nathan sat in the stands beside Richard and Daniel, watching their shared daughter execute routines that required strength, balance, and courage that had been rebuilt through months of patient work and mutual faith in possibilities that transcended medical statistics and expert opinions about permanent limitations. Emily's legacy lived not in the experimental technique that had failed to save her, but in the hundreds of children who'd benefited from research that honored her memory, by advancing beyond the limitations that had defined her brief life and tragic death, proving that some kinds of healing required generations rather than individual procedures to achieve their full potential for transforming human suffering into hope for better tomorrows.